Wait. Go on then. In this video, I will provide you with a simple checklist of things that you can look for when it goes wrong with your compost tea. This is a non-exhaustive list, but my recommendations of places to start looking, investigating, tinkering with and tweaking if you're not happy with the results you're getting from your compost tea, or if you think it's just not as effective as it could be. So today I'm going to talk to you about compost tea again. I had actually got different plans for this particular video, but as is often the case, things can go wrong, and they did go wrong. So I was originally intending to talk to you about Brew Time on compost tea. I was going to put the compost tea brew on and collect a sample after 24 hours, which I did. And then I would leave the thing running and I would collect some more compost tea after 48 hours, which I duly did. However, the 48 hours I left at home instead of taking it to the laboratory, and the kind of analysis was scuppered. So I kind of had to rethink what I would present on in this video. And I've decided to do this while I'm walking the dogs. A bit of a change in scenery. They're having a whale of a time. So while they're running around and we're walking along, we'll get stuck straight into it. So the first thing to check is your compost tea itself. How do you know if it's gone wrong if you're not measuring it? And basically I would advise you to, at least once in the season, check the compost tea, ideally at the start, for how active it is and what the balance between bacteria and fungi is. And I would do this either myself with a microscope, so train yourself up. There are videos that exist. If you think it would be a great idea for me to do a video on showing you how to use a microscope for qualitative assessments, let me know in the comments below. Or what you could do is send your compost tea to a laboratory which will do the analysis for you. But the key thing is you need to test it before you go on ahead in the season and make batches and batches and batches of compost tea. Test it first, and then you'll know that your process is working and the materials you're using are generally right. You don't know it's gone wrong unless you can measure it and you test it. So that would be kind of rule number one, actually, before we even get into the checklist. Nope, we won't watch that. So, first item on the checklist is check the compost itself. I'll say that again. Check the compost itself. The compost material you're using is arguably, well, it is the most important component of a compost tea. And so you need to be sure that the material you're using is mature and filled with all the bacteria and fungi that you need. Again, the way to do this is to check it yourself with a microscope or send it to a laboratory that can do the analysis for you. That's actually one of the things which we do in my laboratory. As well as testing soils, we test people's compost as well. So if you haven't, and you should have, check your compost, and it might be worth looking at how you're storing it. If it's old, perhaps it's dried out and has become less active, and that could have an impact on how effective it is when you actually come to brewing. Now the great thing, though, I thought I'd lost them, but they are back. Here they are. Well, 1 out of 2. It looks like Doug, the smaller dog, is just coming back as well. Great. Oh, and like a well-trained little dog, here he comes back to his master. The second item to check if your compost tea doesn't seem to be as effective as it could be is the water and the water quality. Again, before you set out brewing, this is something that I would strongly urge you to check before you begin. If you're using potable water, so that's water for drinking, that's perhaps come off of the mains supply, chances are it will be fine. You just need to make sure that you give it time to condition before you start to use it. So aerate it, let it acclimatise, so that will get rid of all the chemicals they put in to keep it hygienic, and that will let the water temperature come to the same level as ambient before you start to brew. That would be the first thing. Perhaps though, some of you might be brewing further afield from a supply of mains water, and in which case you will need to perhaps use borehole or even water from a river or natural water supply, in which case test that water. You will need to send this off for an analysis, and I would suggest that you liaise directly with a appropriate laboratory, talk through with them what your concerns are, and they should be able to recommend a test for you. This could range from testing for toxic elements or presence of heavy metals, which might ultimately have a detrimental effect on the plants that you're growing. It could also be for biological contaminants and other nasty things which, once they go into your brew tank, could actually outnumber the beneficial organisms that you are looking to grow. So super important to test the quality of the water, and you'll understand some of the other characteristics, for example the pH, which can also influence the production of microbes that you have in your brewer tank as well. We press on. The third item on my checklist is checking the overall hygiene of your compost tea system, and this could also include how you're applying it, so the spray equipment or even your watering can and the rows that you're using on the spout of the watering can too. What we're specifically looking for are biofilms or the presence of other undesirable contaminants, and we do this by disassembling everything, taking it apart to as small a component as we can get it, individually inspecting, and if needed, well, by this point it's almost certainly worth doing anyway, is giving it a really rigorous clean. And what we're looking for are the presence of biofilms, which I've talked about in other videos. I've talked about cleaning, or what I would recommend doing when cleaning a system, in my video where I show you how to make a compost tea brewer. But biofilms generally kind of have a smeary or greasy green-like appearance. It's a little bit like algae, and those tend to form around connections between pipe work, so around hose fittings. But you might also want to check as far up as the airline and the connection with the pump. So if in doubt, disassemble everything, give it a good clean. If you're still not certain that things are as hygienic as they should be, then consider replacing those parts as well. But hygiene is the third item on the checklist that I would recommend reviewing, making sure everything is as clean and healthy as possible before, during, after brewing, and also when it comes to applying it to your plants and veggies. Well, this has actually turned out to be a gorgeous day. Dogs are having a whale of a time. Lila, as can be seen, completely ignoring me. Normally they're quite good. Today, there we go. Here she comes. Good girl. Lila, hey, sit. Good girl. Hey. Looking for her friend. We shall continue. Number 4 on my quick checklist is the foods that you are using. And by foods, what I'm referring to are the biostimulants or the additional materials that you're putting into the tank in addition to the compost and the water. So this is things like humic acid, molasses. Some people actually use fish hydrolysate, seaweeds, things like that. You want to check the overall condition of them. Now, if you are making lots of compost tea, chances are you're going to be buying a few containers of these things and holding on to them for some time. So checking the packaging for use by information is a great place to start. If they're looking particularly old, consider getting rid of them and replacing. Also, what you want to consider is where you are actually storing them, and if they're kind of outside, because most people will brew their compost tea outside, then they're subject to those temperature and kind of climatic conditions which could have effect on the quality of them. In some cases it could actually make them deteriorate altogether. But you could start by a visual inspection or even a careful smell, being certain that you're not going to infect yourself if there are harmful organisms, and in fact some natural materials it might be a good idea to not try and inhale anyway. But what you're looking for are signs of undesirable organisms which could be contaminating or affecting the quality of your brew. So if you are uncertain about any of these factors, replace them. If you've kind of no idea and it's not too costly to you, I would just consider replace old materials that you're putting in as foods anyway. My fifth suggestion, and there's 6 in total, so we've got one more after this. My fifth suggestion is consideration for the conditions in which you are brewing. If you are brewing your compost tea at the start of the season or even towards the end, the temperatures are likely to be a little bit more extreme. And in fact, if you're brewing overnight, which most people will have to, then temperatures are obviously much cooler in the evening than they are during the daytime. And if they are cool for too long, then the tank itself and the water in the tank is a lot cooler, and that's not great for many of the organisms we're looking to multiply. They are less active, and if they're not active, they're not going to be feeding, and if they're not feeding and breathing in as much of the oxygen as we're feeding them, they're not going to be multiplying at the same rate. So temperature could actually be holding back the rate at which things are brewing. Now, there is a lot of controversy about whether this is an appropriate thing to do, and thermal shock comes into play with this, but some people will actually add heating elements into their compost tea tank to regulate the water temperature throughout the entire duration of the brew. And certainly if you're looking to grow kind of more fungi, produce a more fungal dominant compost tea, adding some temperature to that as well as increasing the time would be an important component. But remember, if you're increasing the time of brew, you could well need to add more foods to your compost tea as well before the organisms all run out. So if things are too cool, if there have been changes across the season when you're brewing, do think about temperature and if that could be having an effect. As I've said, one way to mitigate for that is inclusion of a heating element, but there's a lot of mixed views as to whether that's a good thing or not when it comes to applying the compost tea on your plants and the thermal shock that those organisms could experience. The other thing just to consider while we're talking about climate and conditions is actually the exposure to the sun's UV as well. Now, it's unlikely to have a particularly big role in this, but it's always worth considering if you're brewing in direct sunlight, as well as the temperature kind of effect. You could actually have a brew that is maybe too warm in some locations in the world. As well as that, you're also subjecting these organisms to the sun's UV, and they are soil dwelling or compost dwelling organisms. They don't like direct exposure to the sun. They would rather be underground or covered up by soil or compost. So if you are brewing in direct sunlight, you should have a lid on your tank anyway, and that could help things. As I've said, it's not going to be a huge deal, but ultimately every small kind of percentage gain counts at the end of this. So do think about the climatic conditions and where you're sitting your tank, and it might be that you need to move it and perhaps move to brewing inside where you have a bit tighter control over those conditions. So you could put your tank in your greenhouse or in your potting shed instead, for example. My sixth and final item on the checklist, which I've kind of alluded to a little bit already, so we won't talk about too much, is brew time. Now, for most people, 24 hours is about the norm in terms of brewing a compost tea. Any less than that is often considered a compost extract. I will just move myself into the sun. Yeah, less than 24 hours is considered an extract. But if you're looking to brew the most fungally dominant compost tea, then you're probably going to need to brew longer than 24 hours. Some people recommend even brewing as long as 72 hours. I've completely lost the dogs, by the way. They are now hidden somewhere in there. I can hear them. Well, I heard the snapping of twigs. Ah, over there. Over there. So increasing brew time is an important consideration because, oh, he's just come back. Here we go. Great. I am in control. Brew time is a super important consideration because if you brew too long for the foods that you've put in the tank, those organisms are going to run out of food that they need to grow and multiply. Certain organisms might start cannibalizing others. You lose the diversity in the tank as one organism takes over, or you could get a population crash altogether. So if you are brewing for longer periods to increase fungi levels, for example, then you are going to need to consider adding foods in staged amounts throughout the brew time. That could mean setting your alarm clock for the middle of the night in some cases to make sure that they've got everything they need to carry on multiplying. Similarly, if you're brewing for too short a time or you're making an extract, you're not really giving the organisms long enough to multiply, and so you're only really going to get a more dilute version of the compost material that you started with. And if you haven't tested your compost at the start, then actually you could be starting with something far from standard in the first place and end up with something that is entirely ineffective. And really, that is my big takeaway or summary from this. Like I say with soil, if you don't test, you don't know. It is exactly the same with compost tea. You should be testing as much as you can practically manage, certainly at the start and perhaps even towards the end of the season, just to confirm that the processes you're working, your system for brewing, what you're doing, how you are caring for it, are actually effective and producing the best compost tea that you can. Oh, so the great thing is we're kind of on the final leg now. We're going back up the hill. Hopefully these guys are tired. She's looking a little bit tired. But that wraps this video up. I hope you enjoyed the walk with us. I hope you found the checklist, what I was talking about with compost tea and where to kind of go to if you think things aren't as effective as they could be. If you have some suggestions yourself, please put them in the comment section below, or feel free to drop me an email. I'll put my email in the link below. If you like watching videos that aim to help you grow better food, more healthy plants that are more nutritious, then do consider subscribing to the channel. I'm trying to mix the content up a little bit at the moment, and I'm working on some really exciting projects which will probably be broken across a number of videos. So subscribe and click the notification bell and you'll see when those kind of drop on the channel as well. But that's it for now. I will leave you be and look forward to seeing you on the next video.